The only way anything gets done.
Okay, for those who don't know me, I'm Jackson Schroeder. I do the communications here. So if you've received emails from me, that's who I am officially. Welcome again. And tonight we have Dr. Jay Brandis with us. Dr. Brandis is a professor in the University of Georgia's Department of Marine Sciences and a member of the faculty here on Skidaway Island at the UGA Skidaway Institute. He earned bachelor's degrees in chemistry and oceanography from Humboldt State University, a master's of science in oceanography from the University of Washington, and a PhD in oceanography from the University of Washington as well. He is a marine and freshwater chemist who directs the Skidaway Island Scientific Stable Isotope Laboratory here at the Institute. And he also studies the issue of plastic pollution, particularly microplastics, in Georgia's waters. So please welcome Dr. Brandis.
And thank you all for coming. It's a nice day out there, so I know you're sacrificing a little bit of the weather before it starts getting really, really hot around here. But,
So I'm gonna speak with Dr. Brandis for about 25 minutes, and then I'll open it up for question and answer if any of you have questions. And if we don't fill those 20 minutes, I'll ask a couple more questions because I have them. So I want to start off, can you kind of give us an overview of what microplastics are, what qualifies as a microplastic, and explain how they're formed?
Okay. There's a couple different ways we can tackle this, but the first is to understand plastics as really, microplastics are a part of marine debris. So when you hear about beach cleanups and things like that, that is largely, not entirely, but largely composed of plastics. And microplastics are a subset of those. Now, scientists have a tendency to try and categorize things. Now, the world of marine debris goes everywhere from floating docks and relic ships and things like that, really large-scale things, all the way down to little tiny pieces of plastic that are the size of viruses. So you have this huge range of sizes, and when confronted with that, well, it's very hard to try to define your samples with that kind of range. So we, as scientists, typically kind of divide the problem up. And about 2005, 2007, when microplastics really became a new field, it was decided by a group of the early people that were working on this that we would have a upper size limit of 5 millimeters. Now, 5 millimeters is the thickness of this. These are, just a little thing of sticky notes, but that's 5 millimeters. So it's actually not as small as you might think when you hear about the word microplastics. Now, most of the microplastics that are in the environment that we're really concerned about are much smaller than this. When we first started studying microplastics, there was no lower limit to that size. It was 5 millimeters on down. However, effectively, most people were sampling to about 1/10 this size because it becomes really much more complicated and difficult to sample to that smaller size. However, we've gotten better at that, and we've also been discovering that the really small stuff is concerning. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So nowadays, we define microplastics as 5 millimeters all the way down to 1 micron. Now, 1 micron is about 1/40th of a human hair. So you can think about that being pretty small. Things that are smaller than that, and that is the thing we'll talk about a little bit later, are called nanoplastics because they're measured in nanometers. So 1 micron is 1,000 nanometers, and a virus might be something like 50 nanometers or 40 nanometers in size. So you can imagine this enormous range for microplastics. Now, how they're formed is another area that we have been evolving our understanding in. When I first got involved with this field, it was about 2010 or so, we thought that a lot of the microplastic range of samples was human-made. They were made to be that small because the main thing that people are seeing in lakes in some of the early studies, were what were called microbeads. Now, these were small plastic beads that were put in facial scrubs and other types of cosmetics to, again, act as a scrub. And they were deliberately made to be produced and then discarded. Well, when they started showing up in lakes, this got many groups very interested and concerned. And in one of the few real success stories in this field, they were actually banned by the government, both at the state level and federal level, and their production was banned. Now, part of this was because there were easy substitutes that did not require the companies to spend more money. And it was also nice to be able to sell this to people. Here's a natural product rather than those nasty microplastics. But the truth is that very few microplastics that we see in the environment these days are that type of deliberately made microplastic. Most of them come from bigger things. They can come from bottles, they can come from plastic, other containers, from bags, from clothing. Anything that has plastic in it can produce microplastics and will, over time, if it is not encapsulated and kept out of the environment proper. Now, this figure talks about the different sizes. They're a little bit off on the microplastics and nanoplastics fraction on there, but again, this field suffers a bit from standardization. It's very easy to get into studying microplastics without actually being able to be very rigorous about it. You can look at things in a sample and say, hey, there's a microplastic in there, but to actually get at what that's made of and its exact size and all of those sorts of things is much more difficult. And it's not quite as simple as this either. We tend to think about breakdown of materials as going from bigger sizes to smaller sizes to smaller sizes to smaller sizes. Plastic degradation is different. It does do this. And if you've gone out and collected plastic bottles from the environment, you've undoubtedly come across some older bottles that are really brittle and have broken into pieces, and plastic bags that are broken into pieces and things like that. But even whole bottles start producing microplastics within about 2 weeks. There are studies that have shown that it only takes about that long sitting out there in the environment to start producing plastics or microplastics. But what they start producing are the really small stuff. It starts to fray and it starts to release small pieces. The same with clothing. Our clothing is constantly shedding. It doesn't seem like it to us because we don't normally notice it, but you do notice it in your dryer when you wash it and you get that lint out of it. Well, that's the clothing shedding. It also does it in the washer. It also does it while we're sitting here to some extent. So when we do studies of microplastics in the environment, we have to be very careful not to contaminate our samples with materials that are shedding off of our own clothing. And those are not coming off, obviously not coming off as big chunks. They're coming off as little tiny fibers. And as we will see in a bit, it is a real problem.
So plastics have been around for a long time. I know that we've seen a lot more microplastics now, or at least that's what we're seeing on studies, than previously. Can you speak a little bit about if that's true and why that might be?
Well, first of all, in order to understand that, you kind of have to understand production. So this is a graph of the production of plastics. Now, all microplastics come from production of plastics. Some of them are man-made in that size. Most of them come from bigger pieces. The production of plastics in general has exponentially increased. And what this means is it's not a straight curve, it's actually an increasing curve over time. What this means also in practicality is that 60% of the plastics ever produced on Earth have been produced this century. And that problem is only projected to get worse. The numbers are only supposed to get bigger. You can see that little star on there, 2030, we're supposed to be up in that range of 550 to 600 million tons of plastics produced. Now, this is the source material for microplastics. understanding the connection between that source material and actual microplastic abundances is a lot harder, and we still don't have a great handle on it. Estimates of microplastics in the ocean environment have gone up from 5 trillion about a decade ago to 50 trillion to 150 trillion, and there are a few estimates that go up even higher than that. But the problem is that getting a handle on the oceans and the inventory of plastics in the oceans is incredibly difficult, as you will see when I show you a map a little later on. They are notorious for having variable concentrations and variable concentrations in time as well as space. So what we're looking at here is kind of the source material. You can see that like the bright pink is packaging. That is one of our biggest concerns because we typically are single use. And that's the single-use plastics that we all know and some of us loathe, but they are increasingly being produced, and every time you go to the store, it seems like there's a new type of frozen food that has some sort of new container containing plastics that you have to immediately rip off and throw away. That is a very rapidly and unfortunately very easily lost to the environment and released in the environment, and once it's out there, it starts to break down into pieces. But this is kind of what we're facing right now. This is why in the past 2 decades that we've started to worry about this stuff. When I was born, they were only making 8% of the type of amount of plastics that we make nowadays. And it took until the early 70s before people started noticing plastics in samples in the ocean. But then it kind of sat there and nobody really paid attention to it for about 30 years. And it wasn't until the advent of the research into the great ocean garbage patches, which you probably all heard of, the big areas in the middle of the great oceans, which are concentrating areas for floating plastics. Once people started becoming really concerned and aware of those, they started wondering, okay, what happens to those? And that's when people put a lot of effort into trying to understand microplastics, and we're continuing on that process to this day. So it's mainly, I think, a function of this vast increase in plastic production that we're seeing globally.
So you mentioned a couple of these. You mentioned clothing, plastics coming off of our clothing in the dryer, and that being a big contributor. But are there any specific products or types of plastics, other than what you've mentioned already, that are the major contributors that contribute more than other types of materials?
It's a complicated question. It requires a complicated answer, and I apologize for that. Because the type of microplastic that is polluting your particular environment depends upon things like the physics, the geology, the biology of the area. And so, like, for example, if I go and measure microplastics in the waters off of here in the Skidaway River, what I find mostly are microplastics that are formed of clothing fibers. They're the right size for clothing fibers. A lot of them have the types of dyes that you would see in people's clothing. They're made of the same kinds of plastics that clothing has in it, like polyethylene and polypropylene and polyester and things like that. But you go to a different place, like the marsh edge. You sample the mud there, and you find, instead of fibers, you find mostly little chunks, because the chunks are more effectively trapped in the marsh edges. And then if you go further over and you were to sample near I-95 or some other busy road, you start to pick up another type of what we would call microplastics, even though we don't think about them as such, are tire wear particles. They are very dense, and people are concerned about those because they're full of all sorts of nasty chemicals that are used to, basically modify how tires wear and how they absorb things and stick to the road and that sort of stuff. But you don't see those out here. You only see those next to the road because they don't travel far before they get stuck in the sediments. So what you see in your environment is going to depend upon the kind of environment you're around. That's just what we're finding right now. And I'm more familiar with the marine and estuarine environments than I am with the terrestrial ones. But we see similar types of things in rivers, where the river banks have mostly particulate types of plastics, and the rivers themselves are transporting more of the fiber types of plastics. So it really depends on where you are, what your environment you're in.
So we have known for a little while about microplastics being in our environment, in our waterways, in the food that we eat, and in ourselves. But how more research lately has been focused on the impacts that microplastics have on our health. So can you speak a little bit about what you know about how microplastics impact us? Because we've all read about the amount that we have in our bodies. What are those doing to us? What do we understand there?
Okay. Well, this is one where our understanding of this is just starting to kick into gear. For quite a few years, they weren't examined by the people that study health effects in animals and people. And in the last, I would say, 3 years, we've had a number of studies that have come out, and they are concerning. Now, I will first of all say that I am not that kind of doctor. I am a scientist and not an MD, so I read the literature and I read it with interest, but I am certainly not going to be able to get into the fine nuances of things. I look at the big picture and sort of their big bullet points on what these things are. Now, I would suspect that all of us, or almost all of us, certainly me, 20 years ago would have said plastics are harmless. 10 years ago, I would have said we don't have any evidence for plastics being harmful except for the fact that larger plastics can basically fill up the guts of turtles and birds and things like that. So they can starve to death if they've eaten these plastics and it blocks their guts. But more recently, we've started to see studies come out that are pointing towards plastic, especially microplastics, and especially the really small microplastics, the ones that are like a few microns in size down in the nano size range, being of concern. And a lot of these studies that have come out recently are more of, well, there's a correlation between certain diseases and the amount of microplastics in the environment around those people. And that's just, we can't say, correlation is not causation. So we do not know because there's other things that are in those environments too. So I try to focus on a few studies where they have shown direct effects, or at least very close to direct effects. I put this up here. This is one that was one of the first to really kind of open my eyes. So this was a study done in mice. And why would you use mice? Well, because mice you can experiment with, whereas people you can't experiment with them. So, and what they did is they took two groups of genetically identical mice, so as many other factors as they could, they had the same in them. One group was the normalized ones that were kept in a nice clean environment. The other were fed special microplastics. And these were manufactured little tiny pieces of plastics of a known size, about a micron in size, and made of a plastic that fluoresces. So when you shine ultraviolet light on it, it glows like a spotlight. Now, most plastics, I won't say most, but some plastics do this sort of phenomenon naturally or because of the way they're manufactured. A lot of them don't. But in this case, it makes it really easy for the people that were studying this to see, okay, there's something in this sample and I know where it came from because I manufactured it to look like that and to have that kind of size and everything else. So it made it easier for them to understand. So they put this in their water supply and their food supply, and then they observed their behavior of the two groups. And then eventually, when they got old, they sacrificed both of them and started looking inside their bodies. And they found the microplastics had gotten into their bodies, they had been retained in their bodies, and they had traveled throughout their bodies into their brain. So this picture here is a picture of a slice of brain and a magnification showing how tiny these microplastics are inside the brain of one of the mice. Now, that's concerning enough. And further studies that have come out since then have found plastic materials in human brains and cadavers and in other organisms, as well as different parts of the body. Basically, if you name an organ, they have found microplastics in it, in cadavers and in other organisms. So that's one thing. That's concerning. But again, if we think of plastics as being benign, not causing any problems, but they found behavioral differences between the two, and not in a good way. The mice that were exposed could not pass cognitive tests as quickly as the unexposed mice. They don't know the reason for this. They just know that they were statistically different in the way that they would complete tasks. Okay, so that's the one. Now, more recently, this is a little bit of a complicated study, but they did on the left-hand side are a series of different inflammation markers. And this was a study looking at people that had arteriosclerosis. They had plaque in their veins. And what they had done, I mean, I don't know how many people have ever had this done, but if they detect that it's up here in your carotid artery, they can go in and clean it out, because if you don't, eventually it leads to a high probability of getting a stroke or other types of bad heart interactions. So these, where they looked at that material, so what they did was they scraped it out by standard techniques, and then they looked at it under microscopes, really high-powered microscopes, and they determined that not everybody had microplastics in their plaque, but some did. It was about 60% of the patients had plaque that had microplastics in it. And they did these with a great degree of rigor to make sure that there was no contamination possibility in this. Then they followed the patients. Because, of course, you know, they only cleaned out this part. They didn't clean out down here, wherever. They found, again, in their blood, these different markers for inflammation and things that are associated with enhanced risk of health disease in the people that had microplastics in their plaque. They also found a 4 times increase in adverse health, like heart effects, either death or strokes or other types of effects in the patient pool that had exhibited microplastics in that plaque. Now, correlation is not causation. So we don't know exactly whether it is the microplastics that are causing this or it's something else associated with microplastic contamination that's associated with this. However, there are other studies which have looked at not just the microplastic composition, but the things that go into plastics. Now, we have all probably heard of BPA-free plastics and other types of, like, there was a big movement about 10 years ago to produce plastics that had fewer plasticizers in it and BPA and different types of endocrine or hormone disrupting mimics in plastics. Well, it turns out that there's still other things because they always come up with alternatives. The manufacturers are very clever at this. So they found there were these other types of plasticizers, and those showed an increased risk of heart disease too. So the current theory among the people that study this is it isn't necessarily the plastic that is doing this, but it's what the plastic carries with it. And plastics are known to carry all sorts of chemicals with them, not just the ones they're made with, but what they might pick up in the water around them. And that's pretty concerning. So that's, you know, that's kind of where we're at now. We're finding it in everything, and we're starting to see identifiable health effects that are associated with people that have microplastics in them. We don't understand the mechanisms yet. We don't understand. We can't just say, yeah, plastics are absolutely the cause of this. This ended up being microplastic composition ended up being one of the higher, what they would call traits for, or indicators for heart disease risk factors, but it wasn't the only one. There were others in there, and I don't think it was even the highest one in their particular study, but it was there.
So, all of that said, what do you see? Is there a way for people right now to minimize their microplastic consumption or production, those sorts of things? How do we get rid of microplastics? What can we do about this?
Okay, well, as I said, I talked a little earlier about how they're made or how they are formed. And we also know that sometimes they're formed during the manufacturing process, because manufacturers have not thought about microplastic production during the production process, let's say for plastic bottles, for example. And when people started looking at plastic water bottles and looking at them right off the shelf, they found that they had a significant amount of these micro and nanoplastics in them. Now, that said, then, one of the things that we should consider is not drinking anything that comes in a plastic bottle. That would be where I'm sort of coming from. In terms of reducing your exposure to microplastics, you can choose clothing that is more cotton and linen based. Now, I'm not going to say that that doesn't have some effect, because it really hasn't been looked at. There's so much that has not been looked at, but at least it's not plastic. So if you want to reduce your plastic exposure, having cotton linens, cotton towels, and bamboo and other types of natural materials is a possibility. The other thing is just reducing the amount of plastic, choosing when we are in the store not to buy the thing that's completely wrapped up in many layers of plastic, reusing bags, changing our behavior that way, and making sure that we don't accidentally release plastic, like plastic bottles, out the window of a car. Now, I know nobody in this room would do that, but that is a significant, and is thought to be a very significant source for plastic materials in the environment, is roadside debris. And it's sad, but it is true. And I have made this point in the past, that the more decisions that we individuals do to reduce the amount of plastics that we buy, that puts more pressure on the people that were making that curve go up and up. Because the only reason that curve goes up is because more and more people are buying, or people are buying more and more plastics, or finding new and cool ways to sell them to us and stuff. But we need to understand that that has a cost. And it's not just a cost to the environment. It can be a cost to us, possibly.
So just one more quick question before, I don't know how quick it is actually, but one more question before
I think we had some other stuff, but I don't know.
Yeah, before I turn it over to the question and answer portion. But are you aware of any government policies that have been made that have been either made or, proven effective to some extent at minimizing microplastics?
Well, there's a couple. There have been some studies done where, so I said, washing your clothes produces microplastics. Well, it's not just the dryer, it's also the washer. We just don't see it because it goes down the drain. So there have been studies. There are some washers that have their own filters to trap things like that, but that's a pain in the rear, and most people aren't going to want to do it. But if you do, God bless you, it's great. Where government has been able to do something is in retrofitting wastewater treatment plants. Because the wastewater treatment plants were designed without any thought to microplastics. In fact, they didn't care about the really tiny stuff. They just wanted to disinfect the water and make sure it wasn't going to make people sick coming out of it. But they didn't want to necessarily get rid of everything, especially floating stuff in there. So that has been shown in different studies. If they actually do put in devices and treatment stages that trap plastics, microplastics, and larger pieces, it really does reduce the amount of microplastics that are getting out into the environment from those types of sources. So that's one thing. The other thing, let me see if we're on there. I did want to make a mention about how difficult microplastics are to really, truly understand. The problem with them is that they are incredibly variable. If I go out here and I measure the amount of sediment in the water here, I can get a pretty good estimate of it, as long as we don't get a rainfall event or something like that, I can get a pretty good estimate of it, and I can tie it into season and things like that. And it will be the same tide to tide to tide unless conditions change. Microplastics aren't that way. This is, first of all, a variability on a tidal scale. So those were samples I sent an intern out to the dock, and I had them sample high tide, low tide for about a month. And they found order of magnitude different in concentration of microplastics in their samples during that time period. And it didn't necessarily follow rhyme or reason. We know from other studies around here that this water kind of sloshes back and forth in the tides. And it can take a while for that water that you see on the dock at high tide to really mix out into other parts of the estuaries. But the microplastics are changing faster than that. It's not like they're just a pulse of microplastics that are sitting there. They're really dynamic. And we see that also with the city of Savannah. These little dots here, the big red ones represent really high numbers. The little blue dots represent really low numbers. Again, order of magnitude differences. And they don't go by how far away you are or how close you are to people. They actually seem to increase over distance. They certainly do over the Savannah River as it goes by. But, we have followed up on these types of studies, and there's just as much variability. So if I had like endless amounts of people working and all that sort of stuff on this, we would have this dynamic map of these dots growing and shrinking and doing that with different tidal cycles. And at that point, we probably have a pretty good understanding of where they're coming from and how long they're lasting in the water. But it does make it a really difficult thing to measure. It's not like measuring, the amount of nutrients in the water or the amount of plankton in the water or whatever. It is much more variable. It makes it hard to give cities and states and nations hard, actionable advice. Because again, you measure it one day and it's one level. You measure it another day and it's another level. What do you tell, what do you tell the manager what the average level of microplastics are out there? And furthermore, it was a really interesting study, and this does not have microplastics in it at all. But this is the source material for most of the microplastics. This was a study of marine debris in Australia, and it was over the entire continent. You can see in these different locations, and they compared 10 years ago with now. And they found that levels of marine debris, plastic debris in particular, on the coasts had declined by 1/3. It's remarkable because population hadn't declined by 1/3, it's gone up in that country. Now, it hadn't declined like that. It was basically indistinguishable inland and in inland parts of the study and in land sections that they studied. But along the coast it had. And they targeted a couple things that their government and other groups had done. The first was beach cleanup efforts. And we've probably, a lot of you know that there are periodic beach cleanup efforts on Tybee and in our estuaries here. What they weren't able to address is, how often do you have to clean up to really make a difference? What kind of function is it? At what point do you have diminishing returns in terms of your effort that you're going into that sort of stuff? But they specifically said that beach cleanup efforts and also things which this is definitely a controversial subject, but things like plastic bag bans and plastic bottle bans and stuff like that, which they had put in a lot of these city areas, had made a noticeable difference in the amount of debris in those areas. So there are things that the government can do. It requires obviously pressure from the citizens to make that something that's important to them. Because otherwise all they hear is the industry who says, well, really, we just want to just make more plastics and let, other people can figure out the rest of its stuff. There is currently a international group of people at the UN trying to hammer out a plastics in the sea treaty. And what they run into, they aren't there yet, is that the petroleum producers don't want to see any restriction on plastic production. They don't want to see anything that might reduce their ability to sell what they're producing. And that limits the avenues for plastic removal in the ocean to improving our waste management systems and doing things like the wastewater treatment plant modifications, as well as beach cleanups and other types of cleanups. And there's a tremendous amount of effort involved there. So that's going to be part of the answer. But at the end of the day, when they said at the end, the main thing we need to do is reduce our production and consumption of plastics, and that will be the real solution in the end.
Great. Well, we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. Does anyone have one?
We'll turn on the faucet and get some water. Will the water treatment be successful in removing microplastics from my drinking water?
There's no guarantee. That's all I'll say, is there's no guarantee. And also, my personal opinion is that the drinking water in Savannah is atrocious. And so I would filter the water. You can buy, like, I think Brita filters and some other things that will at least do a pretty good job of filtering out some of the major chemicals as well as microplastics. You can buy things like that if you want to be sure that your tap water is clean of that material.
I'm remembering now that we should go to the overhead mic, so we just want to turn that one on.
Okay.
Question. We'll go here, and
You were talking about some of the things like the wastewater treatment facilities being able to trap some of this stuff. When they trap it, what do they do? Where does it go then?
Well, it goes with all the other sludge that they capture, and they put it in a landfill and bury it. Now, at the moment, sad as it sounds, that's kind of like where we go. Now, there are some that burn it, and in theory, well, if you efficiently burn it in a high temperature furnace, which they typically do because they don't want any pathogens getting out into the environment, that would get rid of the microplastics. I mean, that's how we do things in my lab. If we want to collect samples, we make sure that all of our containers have been heated in an oven at 400 degrees overnight, and that burns all the plastics off, and we don't have a problem with our sampling containers being full of microplastics. And they do this on a larger scale, so they can effectively get rid of them if they use that type of process.
question over here.
Yeah.
So I was sitting next to somebody yesterday, she had a plastic cup, and we looked at it, and it had some kind of a circle logo thing, and it was called, I think, Greenware, so it had some kind of green name on it, and it said, made from recycled materials. So we thought, okay, well, that's nice, and the first question was, but now what happens with this cup? And which really intrigued me, because I thought, well, it may be made of recycled materials, but now what?
Well, and again, what was it recycled from? If it was recycled from plastics, it's still plastic. That's one of the problems I have with a lot of the recycling things. Now, I understand why they do it, because there has been a lot of pressure to try to recycle plastics and create a kind of ecosystem. The problem is that is not economically viable. So typically people or companies that do this are doing this for the PR. You know, they'll make shoes out of recycled plastics or whatever. They're not stopping the problem, because that cup can still break down, and if it gets disposed of in the wrong way, can still produce plastics because it's still made of the same material.
Yeah.
I will say also that there are very talented engineers out there who are busily making much more environmentally friendly plastic substitutes out of things like wood cellulose and so on. The problem with those, and you can buy those, you can find them on Amazon and so on. The problem with them is they're more expensive. So a lot of times, companies don't want to spend any more money than they have to, and that's understandable. But eventually, my hope is that because these are not made with petroleum, that they will be seen as more not only environmentally friendly, but economically friendly, because you don't have to necessarily buy oil from some other place to make it. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about the heat and how heat will affect the leaching out of plastic and something. For instance, if you bought like a container of tea and you could drink it as iced tea, or you could heat it up in your microwave, just sitting in the container in your refrigerator, will plastics leach out less than when you put it in the microwave and heat it up? Will
Yes.
they still, though, leach out when it's just sitting in the refrigerator in a plastic container?
It depends on how old the container is and what it's made out of. Again, there's a non-zero chance that it will do it no matter what. But heat is a known degradation enhancer. And heat will tend to break down plastics, even ones that are designed to handle high heat. It will also enhance the release of other chemicals in that plastic as well.
I know some people take plastic wrap and put it over their bowl and put it in the
Yeah, that's not
microwave.
good.
And that's releasing microplastics into your food.
Yeah, I mean, there's not, I will say this is a little out of my area, but having worked with plastics in the lab, when you like rip a piece of saran wrap, there's little tiny pieces of plastic come off of it, that sort of thing. Question over here?
So I think this is maybe a follow-up related to Phil's question. So I know right now there are a lot of efforts will push us through the biodegradable plastics, right? So what is your opinion about those plastics versus the conventional ones? Because those biodegradable ones can easily break down into small particles like the microplastics.
Yeah. It depends on, again, what they're making the material out of.
They make them out of corn, I know.
Yeah, the
that.
corn stuff is fine. That is, that's that biologically based, not oil-based materials. Now, again, you have to worry about what they added to it. But those, I think, are the best we can do at the moment. There are biodegradable plastics made from traditional plastic materials that have been modified to be more appealing to bacteria. And again, when you start to break stuff down, you start producing microplastics or microparticles, let's say. If it's made out of cornstarch, that's one thing. If it's made out of some odd, polymer that has been designed to appeal to a certain type of bacteria, that's another. And the other thing is, I've talked to chemical engineers in the industry, and what they say, and maybe this has gotten better because this is about 5 years ago, that the problem with the biodegradable, quote unquote, plastic materials is that they're biodegradable only under certain conditions. So they might be biodegradable if they are buried in some sort of sludge in the base of a landfill. If they are sitting on the surface of a roadway, they are not degrading, at least not degrading like that. They're breaking into smaller pieces. So they have to be designed to break down in certain environments. And at that time, anyway, they had not come up with a universal one that would break down in all kinds of environments. So I strongly favor the ones that are made out of cornstarch or cellulose or other types of what we would call biopolymers. They're naturally occurring polymers that are produced by plants and those bacteria know how to break them down, and we've dealt with those for however long we've been in agriculture, at least.
I'm interested in, in studies that may have found microplastics that have been deposited in like the canopies of the rainforest through, are they carried on air currents? Are they that small and they are deposited in oceans and rivers? And
Yeah, good question. Yes, is the answer. As I said, when we're sitting in here, we are breathing microplastics. When we, it's unfortunately inevitable. Again, if I sit in the lab and I just filter the lab air, I get little microplastics. A lot of times they're fibers from my own shirt or from the shirt that whoever's working around that area. And we know that microplastics are carried by airborne currents. That map I showed you of Savannah with all those different splotches, one of my kind of pet theories on this, which we're trying to start to address, is that the reason why it's that way is because it's coming in the air and it's just coming, in little patches into the estuary in different places. We know from other studies that microplastics have been found on every continent of the earth. They have been found at the top of of Mount Everest. They've been found in the Arctic Ocean, and they are carried mostly by air currents in those places. So, yeah, and that's what's so kind of frustrating is that they are everywhere, and you've seen that plot of production. It's because we have made this mess for ourselves. We thought that plastics were benign, that they weren't going to do this sort of thing, and yet here we are.
I'll have time for one or two more, if there are any extra questions.
Yeah.
So what has made you, so in your personal life, with all this knowledge of microplastics, what are some of the things that you do, both rational and irrational?
In terms of avoiding things?
In terms of what do you worry about? Like you look at something and you're like, yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing is I have ceased to buy things like sheets and pillowcases and towels and stuff that aren't made out of cotton. I'll pay the extra amount of money to do that rather than get the, I know that like the mixed polyesters and things like that, they have a different feel and they can be easier to wash and easier to deal with. But that sort of thing I have tried to avoid in my life. The other thing I do is I drink water that has been filtered very extensively so that it doesn't contain microplastics. And I'm quite sure of that because of the type of filter that's on it. I've got one of the best types of filters out there for filtering water.
And that is?
It's actually one you can't buy. It's by a company called Millipore. It's the one in my lab.
Not fair.
I'm sorry about that. But there are ones out there that will do an effective job of this. It just happens to be convenient, and because it is also the water that we use to process all of our samples with, we know it has no microplastics in it.
Yeah, so like those water fountains that say like filter.
Yeah,
like those
that's better than your normal water fountain. I mean, I haven't specifically tested those, but most of them have a pretty nice filtration system. They will filter down to, I think, about half a micron in size normally. The really good ones might get down to like 1/5 of a micron, but most of them are like a half micron in size, and that gets rid of most, we think, of what's out there.
Any last question? All right, in the back.
You mentioned bacteria, and I've read about like bacteria that are geared to eat nanoplastics and that kind of thing. Is that in its nascency, or is that well on its way? Is that very well studied, or?
It has been studied. It hasn't been, I wouldn't call well studied, because again, this whole field is only about 15, 20 years old. And really the rigorous scientifically, what I call where we test hypotheses and we use a lot of techniques to verify what we're seeing, have only been in the last decade. But there's most definitely a correlation between microplastic abundances and the amount of bacteria that are on them. And there are studies that show that they tend to attract, let's say, less savory types of bacteria out there, and that in some cases that can transfer, let's say, pathogens to oysters and other types of filter feeding organisms. But it's, again, it's like a little study here, a little study here, and it's a frustrating field because not all organisms process plastics the same way. Oysters process microplastics differently than clams do, and differently from other types of filter feeders like anchovies do. So it's almost like you have to go, species by species, or at least type by type, and then you have to do, like what type of plastic are we dealing with, and what shape of plastic are we dealing with, and all those kind of permutations. So it does get complicated, but there are a few of those studies out there, yeah.
Well, thanks. Oh, yeah, one last question.
Well, I participated in a citizen science project with you and Jody Sanders.
Yeah, and I thank you for that was a wonderful time.
But I'm wondering, we looked on, I helped with the autoclave and
Yeah.
and all that stuff, and we found all these little fibers and things. Were you able to identify what kind of plastic those were?
They are mostly polyester and polyethylene. We have a device, which I've never talked about on here, and I don't want to bore people with it, but we have a special microscope that allows us to tell what type of material something is made of, especially plastics. And it's extensively used. We have a collaboration going on now with Savannah State, where they are also trying to understand abundances and how plastics are interacting with organisms in our local estuary system. So that's kind of where we're at now.
Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you again to Dr. Jay Brandis.
Thank you.